thank the Brooklyn for Peace for inviting me this evening and organizing this really amazing event. Thank you all for coming out. I'm glad it's not raining. I'm really honored to be sitting among these three individuals who I consider very good friends, but more importantly, who have such a deep and unwavering commitment to social justice. Jamil Dakwar, Dana Neville, and Bina Ahmed. So we're here tonight to explore what is arguably the most contentious, but undeniably the most significant aspect of the Palestinian struggle for liberation and self-determination. The right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes and lands in historic Palestine. In 1948, over 750,000 out of the 1.4 million Palestinians that were living in 1,300 towns and villages were driven out of their homeland in what is present-day Israel to the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, neighboring Arab countries, and the remaining countries of the world. That constituted 80% of the indigenous population of Palestine. Palestinian Muslims and Christians that were forcibly expelled from their homes. Their lands were confiscated, their homes and their villages were destroyed in order to establish a Jewish majority state in their ancestral homeland. In addition, thousands of Palestinians were displaced from their homes, but they stayed within the newly declared State of Israel. And according to documented data, Israel controlled some 774 towns and villages and had destroyed 531 Palestinian towns and villages. The atrocities of the Israeli forces also included more than 70 massacres during this period, in which 15,000 Palestinians were killed. This is why Palestinians call this al-Nakba, the catastrophe. This year, 2018, as Israel celebrates its 70th anniversary, Palestinians mark the 70 years of a Nakba that began in 1948 but continues today. Currently, more than half of the Palestinian people live as refugees. They number about 7 million of 13 million Palestinians worldwide. And they still hold on to their keys of their homes and refuse, even now, 70 years later, to leave those refugee camps because they are determined to return. The right of refugees to return to their homes is an inalienable right. It's a universal right. It's a right that cannot be negotiated away or done away with for pragmatic reasons. And it is also what is just, and it's a basic prerequisite for Palestinians to find freedom, justice, and equality. So our three speakers tonight will further explore this topic of Palestinian refugees' right to their return to their homes. And I'm honored to present them now. Jamil Dakwar is the director of the American Civil Liberties Union Human Rights Program. He worked at Human Rights Watch, where he conducted research, engaged in advocacy, and published reports on issues of torture and detention in Egypt, Morocco, Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territory. He was also a senior attorney with Adalah, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel, where he filed and argued human rights cases before Israeli courts and advocated before international forums. He's a graduate of Tel Aviv University and New York University School of Law, and an adjunct professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Hunter College, CUNY. And he'll be speaking in his personal capacity, not as an ACLU staff member. Dana Neville is a community psychologist and educator, is a co-director of Parsio, a participatory action research center. She's the founding member of the Facing the Nakba Project, Jews Say No, and Jews Against Anti-Muslim Racism. She was a co-founder of Jews for Racial and Economic Justice and the Center for Immigrant Families. And Bina Ahmed is a social justice attorney who has worked with numerous animal rights and human rights organizations. She worked and lived in Palestine. She worked in Al-Haq, where she served on the legal team for the Russell Tribunal in Palestine. She was a legal consultant to Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights, as well as the Norwegian Refugee Council's Palestine Division. She currently serves on the steering committee of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, as well as the advisory board of the Food Empowerment Project and the advisory board of the Animal Rights Activism Committee, an activist group of lawyers and legal workers she co-founded. She conducts Know Your Rights trainings, of which I attended and are excellent, for radical left movements and state-targeted communities. And she currently works as a public defender in New York. Please welcome our speakers for this evening.
Thank you very much, Riham, for the very kind introduction and for your activism and dedication to Palestinian rights issues while working as a dedicated teacher. I know that many of you have the same responsibilities and commitments, and we really appreciate you all coming tonight to talk about this very important issue. And I'm also honored to share the panel with Bina and Donna. In fact, I met Donna first time when we shared a panel on the Goldstone report years ago, and we became very close friends since then. And Bina through her work, both here and when she was in Palestine during very tough time. So I'm really honored to be here and to talk to you about this issue. As Riham mentioned, I'm a Palestinian myself, and I now live in New York, and I was born and raised in Haifa. So I'm one of those Palestinians who their parents or families were lucky enough, fortunate enough to survive the 1948 Nakba and the war and stayed inside Palestine. And one of the 175,000 Palestinians who became formal citizens of Israel, and now number around 1.4 or 1.5 million people. So I will be also speaking from that perspective, maybe in the Q&A. I was asked to speak specifically about the legal rights of refugees, particularly under international law, and as well as connecting it to what's happening now in Gaza, particularly around the Great March of Return, which I'm sure all of you have been following with deep sorrow for the fact that how this movement, the largely peaceful movement of people really seeking return, is being crushed by deadly force on a weekly basis, and we'll talk more about that. So let me just start with more the dry part of what is the right of return or the right to return under international law, and I will go quickly through it. Some of you already know this stuff, but it's really important to talk about the foundations of the right to return. It is really rooted in the international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international refugee law. These are three different sources of international law. So when we talk about human rights law, it's the laws, the treaties that were adopted by the United Nations, ratified by many countries, particularly after World War II. In fact, the right of return or right to return was really a foundational right as part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we will be celebrating the 70th anniversary this coming December. And around the same time, the Palestinians really became displaced and refugees, as Riham mentioned, 80% of the historic Palestinian indigenous community. So when we talk about the right of return, it really comes from the notion of and the lessons really learned from the horrors of World War II and from the horrors of the Holocaust. That is, refugees during that period of time were really in need of not only safe haven, but also a call for protection and repatriation, return to their homes and lands. So from that perspective, the humanity, the global community came together and said, as part of the understanding of how do we protect humanity, the right to return should be a fundamental right, an inherent right that every human being should have the right. And specifically in Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and return to his country. So that's the kind of first foundation. And then this right to return was developed under another important treaty that is called International Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which was adopted in 1966. Many countries, including the United States, including Israel, ratified those treaties. Israel, for example, ratified it in 1991. The United States ratified it only in 1992. But in this treaty, we have another affirmation of the right to return. And it's clear in Article 12.4 that says no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of the right to enter his own country. Now here, what's important about this is that there are no restrictions that could be placed on this right. No restrictions in the name of national security, public order, or safety. These are some of the restrictions or some of the excuses or justifications that countries sometimes use or invoke in order to restrict rights. And they are actually sometimes in the treaties. But in this particular provision, when it comes to the return to your home country, there's no restriction. The only restriction is that it could be suspended during a time of emergency. That is, in a time of war, you may not be able to uphold the right of a person to return, so you can suspend that. But that has to be done within very strict circumstances. For example, the emergency situation should amount to a threat to the existence of the nation, not just any kind of threat. It's not like a passing storm that will make you keep leave away or keep out people from returning, refugees. In Israel, for example, asserted that it's in an emergency situation since 1948 to this day, and every year the Knesset has to renew the state of emergency, which allows the government to use all kinds of emergency situations, which you over here, for example, hear about this only when a time of catastrophes and hurricanes, stuff like that. But in Israel, it is a permanent state of emergency, which in a legal sense, again, from perspective of Israeli legal point of view, allows them to take measures that would, for example, restrict and prevent people from returning to their home countries. Now, the right to return from an Israeli perspective has always been seen as a major way of preventing Palestinians, not just from returning to their homes, but from their ability to be able to take back their properties, to be back to their communities. As Irham mentioned, over 450 towns and villages were destroyed. We'll talk more about some of those horrific details. But the most important thing to remember is that when it comes to the right of return, it is not just like some sort of an abstract issue. It's for people. It's like a whole living experience. It's that you are basically rooted out of your community, and you are told because of your being a Palestinian, whether you're Palestinian Christian or Palestinian Muslim in this case, you are not allowed to return back. While in the case of Israeli Jews, even if you have no connection to the place, if you lived in Moldova all your life or your time, you can actually exercise what Israel calls the right under the law of return, to be able to come and become a full Israeli citizen, while Palestinian refugees are denied their very basic right to return home. We're not talking about citizenship, because under international law, there is no right to acquire citizenship. There's a right of return. What happens after that is something that obviously will be part of what countries have obligations to treat everyone equally and so on. And then from there, there's a discussion about what should really happen. Maybe we'll have more about that. But the most important thing that happened right after the Nakba was that the international community was very clear that that was a violation of all the rules, of all the customs that were at least understood at the time. And therefore, in 1948, in December of 1948, the General Assembly of the United Nations, which is meeting here in New York this year, it passed important resolution 194, which affirmed the right of return with no equivocation, no conditions whatsoever. And it says, and it's really important to quote that resolution, because really it's the foundational resolution for the right of return movement and for all refugees. And it says, in a provision 11, of that resolution. The United Nations General Assembly resolves that the refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return, and for loss of or damage to property which under principles of international law or in equity should be made good by the governments of authorities responsible. So here are the very important notion of affirming the right of return. It is not, should not be diminished by the fact that if you get a compensation, you're not allowed to return. No, it is about affirming both rights. You be restituted and repatriated, and then, or you could choose. And that's actually one of the things that have developed over the years. For example, the High Commissioner for Refugees, which was established also around the same time, given the crisis of refugees in Europe during that time, and the fact that the United Nations was facing this crisis, upheld these rules and these conditions. There are three things that you have to provide to refugees as choices. One is repatriation, and voluntary repatriation is the more preferred and favored one. The second is staying where they are. Some of the refugees, for example, stayed after the war, World War II, moved to a country and they stayed in that country. France, for example, or in Netherlands, or in the UK. They stayed there. If they can stay there, that's fine. The third option is resettlement, something that we talked about a lot here under Trump, where this country now, for example, Trump slashed the number of refugees that can be resettled in the United States to 30,000, which is the lowest number that we've had since we ratified the Refugee Protocol in 1980. So those are the three choices. And those are not diminished. You can choose. The refugee will have to choose. So moving quickly to what does that really mean for the Palestinians. So the Palestinians, very beginning, said, well, we are displaced people. We are people that are, most of our communities are outside our homeland, and we wish to return. Israel closed the borders after 1948, after the ceasefire agreement that was reached in 1949, and basically made it clear that anyone who dares to return, who crosses the border, will be shot at and killed. And between 1947 and 48 till the early 50s, 1950s, there were thousands of Palestinians who were trying to come back from Jordan, from Lebanon, refugee camps, and who tried to sneak in back to their homes and to their communities. Many families were separated. Again, thinking about those family separations that we're all outraged about. This is the kind of thing that happened on a horrific numbers, right? My family, my mother's aunt was separated. She left to Lebanon. She was never able to come back. She died a few years ago in Lebanon. Was never able to return, even though she was living just blocks away from the rest of her family. And so all of that stuff happened while Israel, by force, said, we will not allow any Palestinians to come back. Because we have, and that is in a situation where we know, historically know, that was after a very planned decision and premeditated decision of the Zionist forces led by the Haganah, and Ben-Gurion, who was leading the Haganah, to make sure that we deport as many Palestinians, we destroy their property, we do not allow them to come back. And in the situations where you find that certain Palestinian communities remained, like for example in Nazareth, if you go back to the history of Nazareth, where my wife comes from, there was a decision to deport them, by force, but at some point there was a disagreement within the Zionist forces, and then there was the consideration: what do we do if we deport this largely Palestinian Christian community? We would have a terrible way of explaining that to the Western world, particularly because Nazareth is one of the three most important cities in the Holy Land, right? So there was a decision that, okay, well, let's just keep the community there. And they reached a ceasefire agreement, and basically the Palestinian community in Nazareth surrendered. There was a ceremony even of surrendering the town with little fighting and little casualties. Although there are some who left and couldn't come back, and all these stories are now and more becoming known as people are speaking, because there is a trauma of the Nakba that is, by the way, continuing, including for not my generation, obviously, so we didn't live the Nakba, but my parents and my grandparents that did not really want to talk about this stuff. So the last thing I want to close with is just quickly is about why the Palestinians in Gaza are staging protests on a weekly basis. And we've seen those images, and this is incredible. They've been doing that since March 30th of this year, every Friday. And yet Israel has been saying, no, you can't even get close to the fence. There's no border, by the way, because Israel has never defined its border. You don't even come close to the fence and we will make sure that you get killed. A policy that was approved by the Israeli Supreme Court. I was with a delegation during the time that the Israeli Supreme Court heard arguments or cases, petitions filed by human rights organizations. And it was shocking to see how the government was defending its policy of why we would use live ammunition as a first choice as soon as somebody gets close to 100 meters close to the fence. And they could not really explain it other than to say that we're going to be, there will be like hundreds and thousands of people who will be coming into the country, and what are we going to do next? What are we going to do? We can't allow them to come in, and then there's all the fear mongering that is parcel of the narrative, that is refugees are coming back home. The same fear mongering that we're hearing here, we're hearing in Europe, and it's been always against refugees. And we have to really understand why is it where we can understand people saying, well, how can they come and take my home? But the question is really, is that what the Palestinians really want to do? And I think most of the Palestinians who are saying we have the right of return, they understand the reality is that it's not saying that we're gonna, push everybody else to the sea as the propaganda goes. So I think we have to really ensure and affirm the human story of the Palestinian refugees first, that they're supported by legal rights. And the fact that the people in Gaza, most of whom are refugees and live literally miles away from their original towns and villages in the south of Israel, can't even get close to where they used to live, or their ancestors, their fathers and mothers and grandparents used to live. And so we have to see why people are protesting, not just because they want to go and get shot, because they have no hope left. In fact, the numbers that came out just yesterday from the World Bank released a very concerning, troubling report. It says 1.8 million people live in Gaza. Every second person in Gaza is now living in poverty. The youth unemployment has come to 70%, right? 50% of the unemployment rate in general, unemployment in youth, 70%. These are the same youth that some of them are going to protest because there's no hope. What are they going to do? 80% of the population lives in, under humanitarian aid. So with that, I think that what we really need to discuss today is what are the ways forward for the rights of Palestinians to be realized in a way that is consistent with decency and humanity, with international law, with a way that will really be possible for all people, and for really ensuring that there will be the right of return is the foundation for a just peace, which is something that I truly believe in. I think that there's so many solutions been tried and failed. There was one thing that was really never tried, is to really recognize and acknowledge first the right of return. There is no recognition whatsoever. In fact, there's a denying of the Nakba. There's a denying of the right of refugees. And in that sense, makes things worse for reaching a just solution. So it starts with the recognition and affirming the right, and then we can talk about practical solution of how to make it work so that all people can enjoy equal rights and dignity. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi, Charlotte, and Brooklyn for Peace for inviting me to join you this evening. I'm particularly pleased to be on the panel together with my dear friends and colleagues, Bina, Jamil, and Riham, for whom I have such admiration and respect. I speak to you this evening from my perspective as a white Jewish woman living in the United States and as a partner to the Palestinian-led movement for justice in Palestine. Last week, during the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, someone I was speaking with said that he never imagined that Israel would end up being as anti-democratic and brutal in its behavior as it is today. We both shook our heads in great dismay. But soon after we commiserated about that, I began to think more deeply about Israel's history and the reality of that history, and how and why we've gotten to the point where we are at today. So my focus this evening in my brief remarks will be on that history and on why I believe those of us in Jewish communities and beyond need to therefore center on the Nakba in our learning if we are to be truly accountable partners to the movement for justice in Palestine. For many of us, myself included, that meant and continues to mean unlearning years of education in which the story of Zionism and of Israel's creation totally ignored the consequences of the people who were living there, that is, the Palestinian people. The Nakba, as we heard this evening, refers to the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians from their home and land before and during Israel's creation. A Jewish majority state was created in Palestine because the Zionist movement dramatically reduced, through a variety of means, the numbers of Palestinians living there. As Riham made clear, despite propaganda to the contrary, Israel was not a land without a people for a people without a land. And despite other propaganda claiming that Palestinians left on their own accord or because they were instructed to do so by their leaders, of the 530 villages and cities that were destroyed during the Nakba, the majority were a result of military assaults and expulsions by Jewish Zionist forces. A striking example of this was Plan Dalet, launched in March 1948. It laid out a blueprint in great detail for the destruction and forcible depopulation of Palestinian population centers. Included in the text of Plan Dalet, which is available for anyone to see, is the following, and I quote, "In the conquest of villages in your area, you will determine whether to cleanse or destroy them," unquote. So why is it critical for us to understand more about the Nakba and what really happened during those years? Because in my view, with that knowledge and with a deep recognition of how, for example, thriving Palestinian villages were destroyed and replaced with Jewish villages, it is then not complicated at all to understand why Palestinians have the right to the right of return. That is, the right of return wouldn't then be thought of as something Israelis need to give to the Palestinian people as a gift, as a favor, but rather it would be understood as a right that is theirs and to which they are fully entitled. For those of us who are Jewish, we know that Israel claims to speak in our name and in the name of Jews across the globe. I think it's critically important for us to be visible in making clear that this claim is patently false. I also think it's critically important for us to be visible in making very clear that the right of return is a right that is only necessary because of the actions of the Zionist movement and then of Israel from its inception. So while it is true that the current Israeli government is increasingly anti-democratic at best, we have to acknowledge and then reckon with and act upon the knowledge that the origins of the Jewish state were fundamentally rooted in a grave injustice to the Palestinian people. And the Nakba, as we heard tonight, did not have an end. In fact, it continues to this very day with massive land theft and violence toward Palestinians at the hands of the Israeli government and its military, as well as individual acts of violence perpetrated by some Israeli Jewish citizens. That is, and I think it bears repeating, the Nakba, the extreme violence and ethnic cleansing, is not a one-time event, but has characterized Israel's history and continues to characterize its current reality. We all know that liberation at the expense of another people can never lead to true liberation. So what is possible? In addition to many Palestinian organizations focusing on the rights of refugees and other related issues, there is an Israeli Jewish organization called Zochrot, which means remembering in Hebrew. And I quote, Zochrot promotes acknowledgement and accountability for the ongoing injustices of the Nakba, as well as the reconceptualization of the return as the imperative redress of the Nakba and a chance for a better life for all of the country's inhabitants. Zochrot serves as an inspiration to many of us in U.S. Jewish communities working to bring these issues to the forefront in our communities, and the Facing the Nakba project that I'm part of grew out of our relationship with Zochrot. They also look concretely at how return can look, and it's very worth going to their website. It's Zochrot, ZOCHROT.org. For example, you'll see on their website that some of the questions they address include, what might return actually look like on the ground? What needs will have to be met for the refugees to come home and be reabsorbed? How would major social institutions be reorganized to prepare for return? Zochrot encourages Israeli Jews to recognize that creating a space based on the rights of refugees and their descendants to return home is not about expelling anyone, but it's about building a society that ensures equal rights for all and that is not rooted in a relationship of occupier and occupied. So in terms of looking forward, the Palestinian-led call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, is growing across the globe. It is a call until Israel complies with basic principles of international law and human rights. And of course, the right of return is one of those rights. It is not a call to deny people of their rights. It is a vision and a call affirmatively for equal rights and dignity for all those living in Palestine and Israel. Despite the attacks on BDS from Israel's supporters, it is, in my view, quite a straightforward and I would say elegant call for justice. And as I said in the beginning of my remarks, I do believe that the more we understand the root cause of for BDS, that is, the more we understand about the Nakba, the more the right of return and the full BDS call not only makes sense, but is in fact the only ethical path. Thank you.
That's beautiful. Thank you everyone so much for being here. I'm so honored to be on this panel. First, thank you so much for Brooklyn for Peace, especially Naomi and Charlotte for doing this, organizing. It's really unbelievable. So with that, I want want to, place what we're talking about in a larger political context. We could talk, there's so much more that I'm sure we'd all, I would love to say too, in addition to the brilliant words of Riham and Jamil and Donna. But I would also love to start with, putting this in the larger political framework of, more than just Palestine, and as much as I do this work not just because I love Palestine and the struggle for Palestine, and the cause for Palestine is so just and so noble, but that we do this work because it's a noble human rights struggle, and because we care about human rights. I personally don't do this work just because I love Palestine, but because I love justice and I care about justice, and I can't stand any injustice or any human rights violation to occur, especially if we can organize and do something about it. And so Palestine, and particularly the right of return, what we're talking about, is really a human rights struggle like all human rights struggles. And it's no different. So placing it in a context of indigenous struggles for self-determination and the freedom of movement, as we've talked about, and the right to just a basic home and homeland, to be free of colonization and be free of cleansing of one's land, of your history and your peoples and your culture, and freedom from racial segregation. I mean, these are all things that I think have brought people to this room, brought people to their different varying organizations, and that's the theme and the thread that I think weaves through a lot of New York City, but weaves through a lot of why people come to this work and out into the streets. And we have to be morally consistent, right, in our struggles for justice. And so we can't be, as we often hear, they're progressive except for Palestine, right, PEPs. Or, I'm just, or POOPs, right, progressive, only, right, only on Palestine, right? So you can't, be progressive except for, right? Like the same thing where you couldn't say, I'm sure people wouldn't really accept if someone was like, I'm progressive except for the black and brown folks, right? Or I'm progressive except for the women, or the, gender non-conforming folks. Because I think it would be okay to then say, well, if you're progressive except for Palestine or for women, then I would just say, well, maybe you're really not progressive. And so we need to challenge that, because I don't think there should be an except after that statement. You should just be progressive, or maybe let's push over radical a little bit, and we'll maybe get there later. So talking about these other examples that maybe can help lead us into, and maybe you can all start to think about, well, what brought you into social justice work in the first place? And what were your first entry points into social justice work? So for many people, thinking back to the South African apartheid example. So that, of course, was a very classic example of the anti-colonial struggle against an occupier claiming an inherent and exclusive right to South Africa and South African land. So white Afrikaans proposed an unjust compromise when, of course, the struggle against South African apartheid reached its feverish height. Proposed this unjust compromise of saying, well, we can create these Bantustans, right, for indigenous black South Africans, or segregated lands, as one set of land will be for the white occupier Afrikaans, and one will be for the black indigenous South Africans. And this will be okay. This will be our solution. This will be our compromise. Instead of conceding full decolonization or full desegregation, this will be a way that we can live and we can compromise. We're not going to let black South Africans be able to live over all of black South Africa. You'll just live in these sections, and this will be okay. This is how it's going to be. And that, of course, was rejected by black indigenous South Africans as not an acceptable solution. And because it stopped far short of true justice. And so, hope people are seeing that I'm saying this is very similar to denying the right of return to all of Palestinian refugees to be able to return to their homelands and to live in a desegregated Palestine, to be able to claim the right to be able to return home wherever my home is, where I claim the right of return is. Wherever my home was is where my home was. And the right to where my land and my family is. And wherever you want to say where Israel is, if that is where my home is, I have the right to return. And so in this anti-apartheid struggle, this anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa was, of course, characterized as illegal and violent. And the ANC, the African National Congress, at one point was declared unlawful and exiled and banned, and pushed out of South Africa. Now, of course, the ANC is the ruling party in South Africa since the fall of apartheid in 1994. 1994, people, by the way, I would just like to put that out there. It's not that long ago. I graduated high school in 1997. You can do the math, but I mean, that's not that long ago. So, and I sort of remember the struggles for, anti-apartheid. So it's not that long ago, just to put everything in context. It also just shows that we can win. But it's still not over, of course. Formal legal apartheid ended. Economic apartheid still exists within South Africa, and that's a whole other discussion. But many activists come to this work from their work in other freedom struggles and struggles for justice. So, of course, similar to our U.S. apartheid, the civil rights movement in this country fought against our own legalized apartheid and racial violence and racial segregation. That, of course, was its own compromise, where our systems tried to compromise and say, well, we'll propose, the civil rights movement fought against this legalized racial segregation where white supremacy proposed in this country. Jim Crow as a compromise to full, desegregation and full racial justice and full radical, liberation for folks of color. Like, well, we'll just have Jim Crow, right? We can just have things separate, and this is going to be equal. This is going to be okay. We're not going to really allow people to live where they want to live and allow freedom of movement and full human rights, and this is going to be okay, right? Because things are, relatively, equal, right? We've ended, the most brutal forms of violence, and this is going to be okay. And of course, as we know, that was roundly rejected. And this overtly racial discrimination has, as we know in the books, as lawyers know, that's overt racially discriminatory laws have been outlawed. Hopefully everybody in this room also knows we clearly have not won the fight to abolish racism in this country. I hope everyone is clearly out in the streets with us. But as we know, that this has been rejected, at least formally on the books, and these struggles are still being fought. So, so everyone's now starting to think of the juices of what brings you to social justice work and what were the first things that brought you to brought you to this work. So for me, my personal story, and why people might, oftentimes, and it's always a compliment for me, people will think that I'm Palestinian and will come, speak Arabic to me, and I wish my mom, when she made me read the Quran out loud in Arabic, that she actually taught me what it meant. As many Muslims know, we read the Quran out loud in Arabic, and I'm like, I speak Urdu, and I wish she had taught me Arabic, but I don't actually speak Arabic. I'm Pakistani and I'm Muslim. So many people will think I'm Palestinian. It's a compliment, but of course I'm Pakistani. And so then people will be like, why are you fighting so hard for Palestine? And I laugh because, many people don't really know the history of Pakistan, how it was created, and the history of South Asia. And for me personally, I don't come to this movement simply because I'm Muslim. Some people might think, well, Muslims just care about Palestine, and there's something like the Dome of the Rock, right? And it's something holy, and Muslims all care about it. Well, no, yes, there is, but I came to Palestine because of my family's own struggle for basic human rights and dignity. So my family, my father was 9 years old, and then, of course, my grandparents were older. My entire family survived the partition of India with the fall of the British Empire and the decolonization process, as Frantz Fanon will, of course, say that the decolonization process is inherently violent in most countries when they are decolonized by their foreign occupiers. So the British occupied India for a very long time, and during that decolonization process in 1947, it was one of the bloodiest civil wars in human history. So my family survived that decolonization process. They were lucky to survive, but my father was 9 years old, his older brother was a few years older, and they all survived the partition process where Pakistan and Bangladesh, which at that time was East Pakistan, was created. And within, they say, the stroke of midnight, millions of people were displaced. It was the largest forced mass transfer of human beings in recorded human history. And millions of people were trafficked and murdered, if not mutilated. Children were trafficked back and forth. Women were raped and murdered back and forth. Families were separated. And my father and his older siblings and younger siblings saw all of it. They lost a sibling at one point. They fled for their lives. People are murdered in front of children. Villages are burned. And so people see this. These stories, are passed down to me, to my siblings. And so, that story is very powerful, and it kind of passes down to, the next generation. And so you grow up with that story, and it's not even like, my dad taught me about Palestine, but not like, you should care about Palestine because you should care about Palestine. It's more like, you should care about human rights, because I've lived through, what it's like to be displaced, or I've lived through what it's like to be ripped from your homeland. I've lived through what it's like to see your village burned down. I've lived through what it's like to run outside in just your t-shirt, and that's literally the only belongings you have. I've lived through running to a refugee camp, and that refugee camp you have to flee after a month because the mobs are coming and they're going to then they come and murder everyone in the entire refugee camp. And I've lived through them being smuggled into a caravan truck that's covered in canvas, and that's the way you survive. sorry, it gets emotional. So those are the stories that people grew up with, and I want to bring those stories in the room, because that's what we're talking about.
Thank you.
Thank you to the person who said thank you, gave me a moment to be like, oh, okay, we're okay, whoever that was. So, so my family moved over the border to Pakistan. And so, Pakistan is its own version of special. So then, Pakistan isn't over either, because my family is its own persecuted sect within Islam. So we're Ahmadi Muslims. So Ahmadis in 1977 were declared non-Muslim by the Pakistani constitution. So we don't have equal rights within Pakistan. So if you have a Pakistani passport, you're declared non-Muslim. So we can't actually get into Mecca, for instance, is one thing. Is if we present a Pakistani passport, you are not granted permission to enter. So and so many of my family have left Pakistan and fled. So these are the stories that we talk about. So if people think about why do you care about Palestine, it's like, why do you not care about Palestine? Why do you not care about human rights violations and children being torn from their families? And so when we talk about children being torn from their families, everyone is and should be, or everyone in my world, and everyone should be torn, and up in arms about the children being torn from their families at the border. And that is what's happening, in Palestine, when we talk about the children being, murdered at the border when they march to try to return home from Gaza. And, when we talk about, for instance, the mass incarceration conversation in this country is finally happening. And that's partly, the stories of my family and the stories of so many other families is partly why I became a public defender. Is that, that's I think about Ahed Tamimi and this, how everyone rightly was so enraged at this, she's a child being jailed for months for what? And then I think of the children that I represent, that New York is one of the last states that, still charges children as adults for crimes. And that's no different, when we fight for those human rights of people who are incarcerated and ripped from their families because you're poor and you're black and you're brown. It's like these are the struggles that if that brings you out in the streets, as fighting Trump's or Obama's or our country's deportation machine, because a border has declared them somehow unlawful because that border crossed them, not because they crossed the border, or because, we've incarcerated them and their families and we just decided whatever act they committed was illegal, if that brings you out in the streets, or, if any kind of, war, and the genocide that we commit in other countries brings you out in the streets, and Palestine should too. And that's sort of like the message that I hope that, me bringing up my family's story brings up for other people, and I hope that people see, I know that Palestine and the right of return can be a struggle for people, but if these other struggles are not a struggle for you, then Palestine shouldn't be either. So I'll end with that, and then we'll go into a question and answer, but thank you guys so much for being here.